Good afternoon, good morning for me in Queensland. That keeps getting the daylight savings times swapped around. This is the US Market Intelligence Briefing Workshop on how to set up business in the US with Jack Chi, who makes accounting really engaging and quite interesting. So I'm going to hand over to you, Jack.
Alrighty, thanks, Charlotte. And look, I'll try to make it as engaging and interesting as possible. It is accounting and tax after all. So, hey everyone, nice to meet you all. For those attending and for those watching the video, because this is something that can be regarded as ongoingly relevant content. So I think you should hopefully stay relevant and useful for a while. I'm a chartered accountant with a partner at a firm called William Buck, so we're a mid-tier accounting firm, and my team works exclusively with tech companies, big and small. The questions that we get fairly regularly from clients looking to do international expansion, I've tried to distill into a session today with some slides, which I'll share screen in a second. What I'll say before I start, though, is that this is very much focused on the Australian and international structuring side. I can't talk about the US tax details specifically because I'm not a US accountant. And so for US tax, employment tax implications, you will need to appoint a US tax advisor based over there. Okay, so that's something that I'll clarify about the scope of today's discussion. So feel free to jump in at any time. Or no worries, Bevan, turning off your video. Feel free to jump in any time, and we'll have a Q&A session towards the end as well. Okay, so all right, so I will share the screen now. Okay, so the topic of today is preparing your startup for international expansion. Okay. The topics, sorry, let me just get the overview of the topics today. We're going to talk about some structuring fundamentals first before we get into the international element. And we're going to talk about, move on to international expansion, how to structure for that. Then we'll talk about the Export Market Development Grant, or EMDG, which is very relevant for a lot of people going overseas, and some other considerations. So structuring fundamentals, and this is something that's relevant for all startups. So these are fairly ubiquitous concepts, whether you're going overseas or not, and it is worth quickly going through them. So there is an assumption that you're operating through a company. Why? Because you access R&D tax incentive, there's limited liability, and there's lower tax rate. Okay, so when you hit profitability. Shares in a company are often held through a family trust of the founders and not personally. And why would you do that? For asset protection and for potentially distributing income to beneficiaries on a lower marginal tax rate in the future. There is often a corporate group structure that gets used. Okay, so you can have a single standalone company that does everything and holds everything, but as the company matures, you tend to need a group structure that separates IP from the trading operations and trading risk of the business. And you have a holding company at the top, you have a trading company beneath that, and potentially a IP company owned by the holding company, or the IP could just straight out be owned by the holding company. Okay, and then when you have a group structure, you have an income tax consolidated group and GST group. Tips and traps when it comes to restructuring, your legal structure. Okay, so transfers of assets is calculated at market value for tax purposes. So any kind of IP assignment, asset transfer within the group, even though it's within group or between related parties, is still regarded as at market value. So unless it's wholly within a tax consolidated group, you really need to think about what is the market value of the asset being transferred. So don't just go ahead and just do that without considering tax. Second point, the sooner you structure the right structure, the better it is, because the values, they get bigger and bigger over time, okay? And so is bigger the tax problem. There are a lot of tax concessions or tax exemptions available if you restructure in a certain way. Definitely use those where possible. And what I say to people is that, when it comes to structuring, start with the end in mind. So plan now for whatever the exit looks like. So what does the hypothetical buyer want to buy from you? So, include all the assets that's needed within a neatly packaged business structure, and don't include things in there that, the buyer wouldn't want. I know you'll need a crystal ball for this, but certainly there is a need to do things in a clean kind of way when it comes to structure. All right, so let's talk about international expansion. The reasons for international expansion, you may be accessing specific testing facilities or locations, accessing a broader pool of overseas investors, or just simply entering the overseas market. You could be doing it to attract and retain skilled employees, or maybe that you've decided that there is an exit down the track in that jurisdiction. Okay, choosing the appropriate structure. There's two main structuring options when you go do an international expansion. You can just straight up set up an overseas subsidiary, i.e. the Australian company owns shares in a foreign company. If it's US, a lot of the time we find that people incorporate in Delaware, a Delaware company, because the state taxes over there tend to be a lot more benign compared to some of the other states, for example, California. The other alternative is to set up an overseas head company, i.e. a new foreign company is put in between the existing shareholders of the Australian company and the Australian company. So this is done in a process known as a flip-up, okay? So which of the two is appropriate for you depends on your reason for entering the overseas market. If it's just accessing the new market, testing facilities or employees, overseas subsidiaries is enough, okay? So having an overseas subsidiary will achieve your aim. If you're accessing capital or potential or make yourself more attractive potential acquirer in that jurisdiction who want to buy shares or invest in shares in a company of their own jurisdiction, then overseas head company might be the way to go. Or a lot of the time, those investors, they might be brave enough to come here and invest in an Australian company. So it depends on the level of sophistication. How well do they know international markets like Australia? Right? When you set up a overseas company, be a subsidiary or head company, you might say, oh, look, this is all part of the same group. It's all the same business anyway. We'll just keep things simple. What often gets neglected is intercompany agreements between overseas subsidiary and the head company in Australia, or head company in US, in overseas, and the Australian subsidiary, okay? And this is actually quite important for a number of reasons. There's legal and commercial reasons why the intercompany related party transactions have the correct legal documentation, but also very specifically for tax, okay? So the tax authorities in Australia and the US, they all expect legal agreements to be in place, even though it's all part of the same business group and same ultimate owners. And the reason is that tax is highly documentation driven. There needs to be clear delineation between who does what and who brings what to the table, and how much is the consideration. Okay, and the reason this is relevant is because the reason they want that is because the tax authorities, they want to collect what they regard as their fair share of tax. Okay, even though tech companies by the whole initially they're loss making, that doesn't matter. The tax authorities still expect that. The typical intercompany agreements include loan and interest agreement for any funding provided from the head company, usually in the form of a loan. So, you need a loan agreement as you normally would between two unrelated parties. There needs to be licensing agreement for the use of IP, and there needs to be service and management fees for the use of employees, resources, and any other assets. Okay, and the agreements and the intercompany transactions, it must reflect what's known as arm's length principles, which means that it's done at a price level that is reminiscent of what you expect to see between two unrelated parties. Okay, and this is what the tax authorities expect, because they all want to collect their fair share of tax. So let me give you an example. If Australia, the Australian company is providing managements and services to the US company, and the US company doesn't pay Australia any amount for that, effectively you have a lot of expenses in Australia and no related income. So that reduces the prospect of the Australian tax authorities collecting tax on that. And so the Australian tax authorities will be not very happy at all. Okay, and vice versa if the situation is reversed. So agreements are definitely, it's a compulsory thing. So don't kick that can down the road. And those three types of intercompany agreements are very, very common. And, there needs to be a good reason why, you're not doing it if they're absent. Tips and traps in choosing the appropriate structure. So be sure it's the right long-term structure. One example is, don't just do a flip up willy-nilly. You really have to be sure that that is really the long-term path of the company. Because if you flip up, I've seen people want to do a flip up because they're joining some accelerator in the States, and that accelerator expects the flip up. Okay, and I say to the tech companies, well, look, that's all well and great, but the thing is, you don't want this situation where you do a flip up, incur a ton of costs, become a US headquartered company, and then you go, okay, now that the accelerator cohort is done and dusted, I've actually realized I don't really have much to do with the States. There's not an exit in the States. And I think there's going to be an exit in Australia, and then it becomes very difficult to flip back. Okay, then you end up with the ugly sandwich structure where you got an Australian head company in the top, a US intermediate company in the middle, and then beneath that you got an Australian company. So I've seen that before. Okay, so you try to avoid it. When you have a cross-border structure, you need to be clear on where the current and where the IP sits. Okay, so who owns the code? Who owns the algorithm? Like, is it the Australian company, or does it need to be novated to the States, which I sometimes see, right? So if you're going to move IP around, once again, consider tax implications. What's the market value on that? Do you have an ugly tax problem? And how does that affect the R&D tax incentive? Okay, because if there's no IP in Australia, and the Australian company undertakes R&D on behalf of someone else, then the R&D tax incentive requirements change, and you may not be as eligible for it as you think you are. I'm not saying it's definitely going to be a problem. I'm just saying it's a different set of rules where the Australian company doesn't own the IP. That needs to be considered, and get a tax advisor to talk about that with you. Another consideration, employee share option plans. So option plans or share plans, have you got one in place? And if you do a flip up, how do you mirror that? So what happens to the previous plan? And is there mechanisms within the share plan for replacing that with something like for like? What are the tax implications of that? So that needs to be considered as well. So get advice on that. And finally, there needs to be the right kind of intercompany dealings to minimize double tax, because as a whole, the business is probably likely to be making losses for the first few years. But if you don't do things properly, it's very possible that you're going to end up with a scenario where one company makes a profit and ends up paying tax, while the other company has a humongous loss. So I've seen that before, and you don't want that. So it needs to be planned out in advance with your accountant / tax advisor. Okay. Export market development grant. So look, we're all very much across the importance of grants. So R&D incentive, we spoke about, key part of the funding. And with going overseas, export market development grant becomes very relevant. It's essentially the government's way to encourage people to earn some export revenue, to go global. What it is matched funding of eligible export promotion and marketing expenses. So you get a grant of up to 40K, 80K, or 150K a year, depending on the stage of business. But what ends up happening is that you receive less than when you apply. So, an actual amount expected received is around 15K for initial applications, then just under 25K, and then 36K for the later stages. Okay, each claimant has maximum 8 grants. The applications are always reviewed, and they request a sample documentation. And they now have a strange looking forward approach, where if you want to claim for FY23 income, you needed to have made the application before August 2022. So in other words, 23 income years is closed already. So just bear that in mind for future years, okay, if you haven't made an application. Other considerations, AC grant, accelerated commercialization. It's not export specific, but I thought I'd just raise that, just make sure it's on your calendar. It's a competitive grant, but the amounts can be pretty big. There are, just like this slide is saying, there's hundreds of grants at the state, federal, and and also local level, government level. Okay, so the eligibility criteria they all differ. Some is by industry, some is by location, some is to boost female founders. So there's literally hundreds of grants. They come and go, and probably the easiest way is to search for grants. So under this government link that's shown here. Okay. So you go on that link and you put it 3 attributes, and it spits out some grants for you to look into. So when you're a cross-border business, and like it or not, no matter how small you are, once you have companies in other jurisdictions, then you're a cross-border business, which sends you to the world of international tax, and this includes various considerations. So a lot of these considerations are designed for much bigger companies, but unfortunately you tend to get roped into it. So some things to be mindful of. So if there's payments from one country to another, one of your companies to another company in the group, but in another jurisdiction, and the payment is in the form of dividend or interest or royalties, for example, license fees, then withholding tax will apply. What is that? What is withholding tax? Well, whichever country that's making the payment, so that company needs to withhold, instead of pay the other entity the full $100, for example, that they might be required to pay them just $90, and the other $10 be paid to the ATO. Okay, so if the payment falls into one of these categories, you need to be mindful of sales tax, be it GST in Australia or VAT overseas, or some kind of a state-based tax, which you see a lot in the States. So it is theoretically possible to incur US state-based tax obligations if you simply have a customer there. Obviously, this presents the question of how are they going to police that? But there are states that have these obligations, and if your sales build up, then so could the exposure. So just be mindful. Transfer pricing is what I mentioned previously about having intercompany transactions at an arm's length amount, so that each jurisdiction's tax authorities are happy. To get this done, you really need a transfer pricing advisor. It is a very specific part of tax law. So I have colleagues who do this kind of stuff, so happy to make an intro if you need it. There's what's known as CFC, so control foreign company provisions. The moment you have an overseas subsidiary, then this becomes a consideration. So make sure your tax section is across the CFC rules. And there's often some question marks around whether your foreign subsidiaries are actually Australian tax residents because of the central management controls in Australia. This is an area of tax law that is in flux, that the authorities are looking to simplify, but currently it's not very simple. Right? So we spoke about a lot, but practically, what do you need to do? So make sure you have the right advisors in both jurisdictions. So you can't just have an Australian advisor, you've got to have a US advisor and vice versa. So the US advisor would obviously help you with the company setup and talk about the US tax and compliance obligations, give you insights on that. You need to set up intercompany agreements, see what government grants available overseas, and make sure that the intercompany transactions are not done in a way that causes a tax liability in one country and a humongous loss in another country. Okay, so think about that. So that is something that needs to be considered from the start, not as a sort of by the way thing eventually. Okay. So that's it. That's our little session for today. That's my contact details. Feel free to reach out directly or through Charlotte. Yeah, question time.
Do we have any questions about this wonderful area of tax and setting up and all of those wonderful logistics? Jackie's an incredible mentor as well, and is very generous in sharing his contact details, and will answer any questions you have quickly and thoroughly, and doesn't get disturbed by daylight savings times.
Nah, all good. Yeah.
I think everyone's, we're like 2 weeks away, and some people are actually like, Pat is leaving. You're leaving soon, Pat, aren't you? Tomorrow or something? No, okay. Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't leave till the 21st, but there's a lot there, obviously. Between LLCs and Incs in the States, and then what structure is here. Yeah, I get it. And I'm not sure I've considered it in the ways you've outlined. So a lot to think about.
Yeah. Look, you don't need to be a tax expert. You just have to make sure that these things are on your radar, and you appoint a accountant or tax person over there, and you ask these questions to your accountant and tax advisor on each site. Just, hey, what about this? What about that? And see what they have to say.
So, sorry, Jay, can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Yeah. The ecosystem that we're going into in the States, and we're trying to raise funds from and gain business in, their expectations and their knowledge of Australia, which is part of New Zealand, their expectations are going to dictate where the money goes, isn't it? He who has the gold makes the rules. How do you deal with that?
So the expectations of the US investors, do you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't say it's, they call the shots on everything. A lot of the time, it's just an ongoing discussion on the typical things you talk about, cap raise, what do you need the money for? What are you trying to achieve? Is this, is this for, how much of it is for marketing, how much of it for development, you know, what are your plans? So and you know, after that discussion, it becomes a question of, okay, do they join the board? You know, what does the shareholders agreement say? Because you know, if they have a seat on the board, then obviously they have a say. But and you know what shareholder agreement says, that is important. But short of that, I wouldn't say they dictate. You know how you run your business. Ultimately, you know, you're still the founder and CEO and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, Jack, thanks for taking us through that. Some really good tips there. Sorry, I'm not sure my camera. There we go. Any advantages or disadvantages of the flip up versus the other structure that you sort of proposed when entering the US? So yeah, like I said, if you just try to access the US market, or you're trying to get some US talent on board as you know, engineers or advisors, then a subsidiary will do. Okay. Whereas if you only want to do a flip up, if you really want to move the center of gravity of the company to the US, you know, there's some kind of a you know, key investor over there that absolutely demands you want that you have a US head company there, or you are absolutely sure that the exit is in the US. Now, if you're short of that, then you know, just you know, play it by ear. Just keep it as an Australian company, and you can just do a flip up later. So it's not something that you have to do it now, or you miss the boat when you. So this is especially the case if you just don't have enough data or information to make a call. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yep. All right, I think that's it.
Good one. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
I realized I was on mute when I was saying thank you. Thank you so much, Jack. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. No problem.